That's him. That's the one. I warned corporate about this. You hire a man with a record to watch a bank, and one night he opens the door for his friends. Check his locker. Check his history. I promise you the story writes itself.
What are you talking about? Just look at the evidence. All right, we'll check it out. Before you cuff me, ask him why the hallway camera fails for exactly 4 minutes, at the same hour every few weeks. You can't prove a technical glitch is a crime. We have logs. You access the system. Logs can be altered. You have nothing. We'll see about that.
Preston believed he was pointing at the weakest person in the building. A poor man with a criminal record, a night shift, a name no one at the branch had ever bothered to learn. To him, the label was the whole story, and labels were easy to convict. What he mistook for a cornered guard was something else entirely. The calm hands. The notebook filled in advance. The single fact about the camera that no ordinary guard should have known to track. He had just handed a warning to the one man who understood exactly what it meant. But who was Ray Coleman really, and what had he been quietly writing down all those long nights? If you believe the people the world overlooks are the ones worth watching, subscribe to the channel and stay with this one to the end. What Preston Vale mistook for a nobody in a guard's uniform is about to take apart everything he built. The Meridian branch on the edge of town was the kind of place that emptied out completely by 6 in the evening, and that was when Ray Coleman's real work began, though not the work anyone had hired him to do. To the people who signed his paychecks. Ray was a night guard, and a barely tolerated one at that. He walked the floor, checked the doors, watched a bank of monitors in a small back room, and clocked out at dawn. He was quiet, he kept to himself, and he had a criminal record that everyone at the branch knew about, because Preston Vale made sure they knew about it. A man with a mark like that took the shifts no one else wanted, asked no questions, and was grateful to have the job. That was the whole of what they saw. He had a daughter named Maddie, 8 years old, who slept at a neighbor's apartment on the nights he worked, and drew him pictures he taped inside his locker. She was the center of everything he did, the reason he had swallowed 2 years of silence and taken a job guarding the very kind of place that had destroyed him. She didn't know any of that. To her, he was just dad who worked nights and made pancakes in the afternoon, and he intended to keep the ugliness of the rest of it as far from her as he could. What no one at the branch knew was that the record they held against him was a lie someone had built on purpose. 2 years earlier, Ray had not been a night guard. He had been an internal fraud investigator for the Meridian Banking Corporation, and a good one. The kind who read a column of numbers, the way other people read a sentence, who noticed when a figure sat wrong on a page the way a musician notices a note played flat. His job had been to find the money that wasn't supposed to move, and he had been very good at finding it. For years, that had made him useful. Then it had made him a problem, because the thing he found was not a rogue teller skimming a drawer. It was a pattern dirty money threading through several branches, cleaned and passed along too smooth and too consistent to be anything but deliberate. He had done what he was trained to do. He had documented it and reported it up the chain, believing the system he worked for would want to know. He had been wrong about that. The people above him did not want the pattern found. They wanted the man who found it gone, and they made him gone with a speed and a cruelty that still 2 years later took his breath when he let himself remember it. They built him a crime. A file appeared showing that Ray himself had been embezzling falsified transfers, doctored records, a paper trail assembled by people who knew exactly how to assemble one, because assembling false trails was the whole of their business. He fought it at first, the way an innocent man fights. And he learned quickly that a corporation with lawyers and a 2-year head start can bury a single investigator without much effort. The choice they left him was simple and brutal. Take a suspended sentence, keep quiet, and walk away with his freedom, or fight a case he could not win and risk prison and leave Maddie with no one. He took the deal. For her, he took the deal, and he carried the record of it out of the building like a stone in his chest. But he never stopped working the case in his own mind, and he never accepted that the pattern he'd found had simply been allowed to keep running. He knew it had. He knew it the way you know a wound is still there under the bandage, and 2 years of quiet had done nothing to change what he intended to do about it. The night guard job at the suburban branch had not fallen into his lap. He had chosen it carefully, the way he chose everything now. He knew this branch. In the map he'd built 2 years ago before they tore his life apart, this quiet office on the edge of town had been one of the nodes, one of the places where the dirty money passed through and came out clean. It was small enough to be overlooked and busy enough to hide a great deal inside ordinary traffic, and Ray had always believed that whatever was still running, it was still running through here. A man with a fabricated record could not walk back into Meridian as an investigator. But the same record that had ended his career made him exactly the kind of desperate, overlooked applicant that a low-paying night guard post attracted. The job gave him 2 things he could not have gotten any other way. It gave him a legal reason to be inside the building after everyone else had gone home. And it gave him legitimate access to the security systems, the cameras, the entry logs, the whole quiet nervous system of the branch. Because watching those systems was on paper exactly what he had been hired to do. He walked in the front door as the least important person in the company. It was the best cover he had ever had. It took him only a few weeks to see the pattern because he already knew the shape of what he was looking for. Every so often, deep in the night, 2 men came in through the rear service door. They didn't linger. They were inside for less than 20 minutes, and then they were gone, and the whole thing had the smooth, unremarkable quality of a routine that had been running for a long time. Ray noticed them the way he noticed everything, and then he noticed the thing that mattered more than the men themselves. Every time they came, the rear hallway camera failed. Not for the night. For exactly 4 minutes, a clean contained gap logged in the system as a technical fault and forgotten by everyone who wasn't looking for it. Ray was looking for it. As the night guard, he had every right to review and export the security logs, and he did quietly, saving each of those 4-minute gaps with its timestamp intact, building a legitimate record that no one could later say he'd stolen. Then he set the camera failures beside the branch's daily transaction records, and the picture began to sharpen. The gaps lined up with large cash movements that were logged wrong the following morning and quietly corrected a day later. Money was moving through the building in the dark, and the darkness was being manufactured on a schedule. The man who ran that schedule was Preston Vale, the branch manager, and Ray came to understand him the way you understand a lock, by studying how it turns. Preston was a man who loved the appearance of authority more than the work of it. He was smooth in front of the regional visitors and sharp with the tellers when no one important was watching, and he had a particular talent for making other people feel small in ways that were difficult to report. It was Preston who personally handled the late transactions, Preston who signed off on the camera maintenance logs. Preston, who had made sure every employee in the building knew that the night guard was a criminal they'd be wise not to trust. Above Preston, though, he did not yet have the proof in hand. Ray knew there had to be more, because a branch manager did not build a multi-branch laundering route by himself. He suspected the coordination ran up to the regional level, to someone with the authority to move money between offices and make the numbers reconcile across all of them. He suspected it, and he had a name in the back of his mind he did not yet let himself dwell on, because the name belonged to the person who had signed the file that ended his career. Around Preston moved the smaller pieces, and Ray learned each of them by watching. There was Gordon Pike, who ran security for the region and controlled the camera systems across every branch. The one man with the authority to make a hallway camera fail for 4 clean minutes and log it as a glitch, and the same man who held the vault codes. There was a young teller named Marcus Doyle, who Ray watched grow paler and quieter over the weeks, a kid who entered the wrong figures at night and corrected them in the morning, with the hunted look of someone doing something he couldn't refuse to do. And there were the men above all of them, unseen from where Ray stood, kept comfortable and silent by whatever the route was worth. Ray watched Marcus longest, because Marcus was the one who reminded him of something. Not of himself exactly, but of what the machine did to the people who happened to stand too close to it. The kid wasn't a criminal. He was a frightened young man who had been handed a choice that wasn't really a choice, the same way Ray had been handed one 2 years before. That recognition mattered, and Ray held on to it because it kept the thing he was doing pointed in the right direction. He was not doing this for revenge. He reminded himself of that on the long nights deliberately, The way a man tightens a bolt, he knows tends to work loose. It would have been easy to let it become revenge. The people who had done this to him were still up there, still comfortable, and there was a version of Ray that wanted nothing more than to watch them fall. But he had seen what revenge did to an investigator's judgment, and he knew the difference between wanting justice and wanting to hurt someone was often just the direction you were facing. So he kept himself facing outward. The route was still running. Every month it ran, it pulled in more people like Marcus Doyle and spat out more casualties like the customers whose accounts got quietly used and the employees who got quietly removed. Stopping it was the point. His own cleared name, if it ever came, would only be a side effect. That was the discipline of it, and he held to the discipline because the discipline was the only thing that separated what he was doing from what had been done to him. The person who cracked the case open a little wider was a woman named Alice Reyes. She was an internal auditor sent out from the regional office to review the branch's books, and Ray recognized the type immediately because he had once been the type. She had the particular alertness of someone whose numbers weren't adding up and who hadn't yet decided whether the problem was error or something worse. She worked late. She pulled records she hadn't been asked to pull. And she treated the night guard at first as a piece of the furniture, which suited Ray fine because it let him watch her decide whether she could be trusted before she ever knew she was being watched. He tested the water slowly over several nights, with a question here and an observation there, small things, the kind an ordinary guard wouldn't say. He mentioned a reconciliation detail once in passing that no night guard had any business understanding, and he saw her look up at him with a new and careful attention. She didn't ask him how he knew it. She started instead to talk to him about what she was seeing, because she had been carrying it alone and he was the first person in the building who seemed to understand the shape of her unease. Then came the night that changed everything, and it changed everything precisely because no one had planned it. The branch was robbed. Not staged, not manufactured, not one of Preston's quiet nighttime transactions. A real robbery, fast and violent in the small hours when only Ray and the empty building should have been there. It happened quickly, and it was over quickly, and in the chaos of it, Ray did what he always did. He watched. He noticed. And what he noticed made the back of his neck go cold. The men who hit the branch knew things they should not have known. They knew the vault code. They knew the guard's rotation. They knew to the minute the window when the rear hallway camera would be dark. This was not luck, and it was not a break-in. Whoever had done this had used the exact hidden infrastructure that Preston had built to move dirty money, the same dead camera, the same rear door, the same gap in the schedule. The laundering route and the robbery had run through the same weakness, and in doing so, the robbery had dragged that weakness halfway into the light. Ray understood standing in that violated building, with the alarms finally screaming that he could hand over what he had right then. And he understood as fast why he couldn't. Preston would pin the whole thing on the guard with the record before the sun came up, and the larger route, the thing that actually mattered, would sink out of sight while everyone's eyes were on the man they'd already decided to blame. So Ray made the same hard choice he'd made 2 years before. Except this time he made it with his eyes open and a plan behind it. He would let himself be suspected. And he would use the one thing a robbery creates that a quiet crime never does attention to, drag the entire machine into the light before anyone thought to look away. In the days after the robbery, Ray studied the branch, the way he had once studied a suspect's financials, not as a single crime, but as a set of small, deniable arrangements that only revealed their design when you laid them side by side. The stolen money was the loud thing, the thing everyone was looking at. Ray looked instead at everything around it. He looked at how the large cash movements had always been broken into smaller amounts, each one sitting just below the threshold that would have triggered a mandatory report to the authorities. He looked at how the camera failures had been logged month after month, as routine technical faults by a maintenance system that answered to Gordon Pike. He looked at the way Marcus Doyle entered figures wrong at night and corrected them by mid-morning, a rhythm so regular it had stopped looking like error and started looking like procedure. Each piece taken alone was explainable. A threshold was a guideline. A camera glitched. A young teller made mistakes. That was the genius of it. The whole thing was built out of parts that each had an innocent name. But Ray was not looking at the parts one at a time. He was looking at all of them together, and together they were not a series of accidents. They were a machine for moving dirty money through a legitimate branch, while every individual component maintained its own small alibi. Alice Reyes brought the other half of it, and between them the shape of the thing came clear. She had been pulling records since before the robbery, and now she pulled harder, because a robbery meant an investigation, and an investigation meant her audit would be read by people who hadn't read it before. She and Ray fell into a careful partnership across those late nights, she with her access to the books, he with his understanding of what the books were hiding. She stopped seeing him as furniture entirely. She saw him now as the only person who could explain why her numbers had been wrong for longer than the robbery could account for. It was Alice who first said out loud that whoever robbed the branch had to have had inside help, because no outsider could have known the vault code and the camera window both. And it was Ray who understood which insider, because only one man held both keys at once. Gordon Pike controlled the cameras, and Gordon Pike held the vault codes, and there was exactly one person in the entire region who could have handed a robbery crew both of those things. But that was only the first layer, and Ray had learned long ago not to stop at the first layer. He kept pulling the thread, and the thread led somewhere he had not expected. When he set the amount reported stolen in the robbery against the branch's real cash flow, the true numbers reconstructed from the doctored entries and their next-day corrections, something did not fit, and it did not fit in a very particular way. The sum that had been reported as stolen was not a random amount. It matched almost to the dollar a shortfall that already existed in the laundering route, a hole in the books that the operation had created and had not yet managed to close before Alice's audit arrived to find it. And Ray felt the whole thing turn over in his mind, the way a lock turns when the last pin finally sets. The robbery had not simply exposed the operation by accident. Preston had used it. A real crew had hit the branch, perhaps invited, perhaps merely permitted. Ray couldn't yet say which, and Preston had seized the opportunity to bury a pre-existing shortfall inside the loss. Money that had vanished months ago into the laundering route was now being reported as money the robbers had taken. The theft, real as it was, had become a laundering tool of its own, a way to make a hole in the books look like a crime committed by strangers right before an auditor could ask where the money had actually gone. Ray did not build his case on any single one of these discoveries, because he understood better than most how a single piece of evidence dies in a courtroom. A night guard with a record could be dismissed with a sentence. A disgruntled former investigator could be called a man with a grudge twisting numbers to settle a 2-year-old score. He knew all of this because he had watched it done to himself. So he used each discovery the way it was actually valuable as a map that told him where to look for the thing that could not be waved away. The stolen amount pointed him to the shortfall. The shortfall pointed him to the doctored entries. The doctored entries traced backward pointed him to the flow of money between branches, and that flow pointed upward past Preston to the one person with the authority to move funds across every office in the region and make them all reconcile. The name he had been keeping in the back of his mind moved to the front of it. Diane Kessler, the regional deputy who coordinated the money between branches. The same Diane Kessler whose signature had been on the fabricated file that ended Ray's career 2 years earlier. She had not just helped destroy him. She had destroyed him specifically because he had gotten close to the thing she was still at this very moment running. Preston began to sense that the night guard was more than a night guard, and the branch grew colder around Ray by the day. He never learned exactly what tipped them off a record request that reached the wrong desk, a question of Alice's that traveled the wrong way. What he felt was the response, and the response told him he was close. Alice was informed that her audit contract might not be extended, that concerns had been raised about the thoroughness of her work, a threat dressed in the polite vocabulary of a performance note. Both of them understood exactly what it was. Then the pressure found Ray, and it came from several directions at once, each one deniable. His personnel file, thin as it was, suddenly acquired negative evaluations he'd never been shown. He was reminded in a memo of the terms of his employment and the fragility of a man in his position. And Gordon Pike's people began appearing where Ray's life happened outside the branch. No one approached Maddie. No one said a word to her. But Ray saw the same car outside her school 2 afternoons running, and he understood the message perfectly, because it was the oldest message the powerful know how to send. We know what you love. Think carefully. The thing that hardened Ray's resolve rather than breaking it was what they began doing to Marcus Doyle. The young teller was being quietly set up. Ray could see it happening in the paperwork, the way a man's name gets moved one document at a time into the position of the person who will take the fall if the whole thing collapses. Marcus was being fitted for a crime he hadn't chosen, made into the designated explanation, the frightened junior employee, whose signature was on the doctored entries, and who could be handed to the authorities as the guilty party, while the men above him walked clean. Ray had seen this before. He had been this before. And where a colder man might have looked at Marcus and seen a convenient witness to be used, Ray looked at him and saw the whole reason he was doing any of this. The machine did not only steal money, it manufactured guilty men out of frightened ones. And it had done it to Ray, and it was doing it to Marcus, and it would do it to someone else after that, if no one stopped it. Saving the kid was not a distraction from the mission. The kid was the mission, or close enough to it, that the distinction didn't matter. So Ray held his position, and he let none of it show. From the outside, he remained what they needed him to be, a poor man, with a record cornered, frightened for his job, and his daughter, a person being slowly ground down. That was exactly the version of himself he wanted Preston to see, because a Preston who believed he was winning was a Preston who kept moving, and every move the operation made left a mark. Each time they altered a record, the original still existed, preserved and time-stamped in the security exports Ray had been quietly saving since his first weeks on the job, and in the copies Alice had pulled within the bounds of her audit. They were building a case against him. They did not understand that in building it, they were documenting step by step exactly how the machine manufactured a lie. He thought more than once about ending it early. He had enough by now to clear himself, probably. He had enough to pull Marcus out from under the falling weight, probably. But probably was not the same as certainly, and clearing 2 men was not the same as stopping the thing that would keep producing victims after they were gone. He had walked away once 2 years ago, and walking away had not stopped the root. It had only left it running for someone with less power to absorb. He would not make that mistake a second time. There was one night when the weight of it came close to reaching him. He was on the branch floor near dawn, the building silent around him, and he found himself thinking about Maddie asleep across town, and about the car outside her school, and about how thin the line was between the man he was and the man they had already convinced the world he was. He had given up his name, his work, 2 years of his life, and he was risking what little he had rebuilt, and he was doing it in a uniform that let everyone treat him as nothing. There were moments when the sheer weight of being underestimated felt heavier than the danger itself. But he thought of Marcus Doyle's hunted face, and of the customers whose accounts had been used without their knowing, and of the people who had been quietly removed from this company before him, and had no one to build their case. The danger had never been theoretical for any of them. Ray set the self-pity down where it belonged, which was nowhere near the work, and he kept going. He had learned that patience and cowardice can look identical from the outside, and that only one of them ever brings the machine down. Then Preston made his final move, and its cleanness was how Ray knew it had been planned, rather than improvised. Preston formally named Ray as the prime suspect in the robbery, leaning on the record, as if the record were proof. The police were called to the branch, and in front of a scattering of stunned employees, a sum of cash was discovered hidden in Ray's locker, cash he had never touched, placed there by people who needed the story to have a body. Alice was let go the same day her contract terminated, her access revoked. And the night's security logs, the ones that would have shown the truth of the camera gaps, were reported as permanently corrupted, damaged beyond recovery. Ray did not resist any of it. He let them cuff him, let them walk him out, let them believe the whole thing had closed exactly the way they'd designed it to close. And in doing all of it, they had made the two mistakes that would end them. The cash in the locker and the report that the logs were destroyed were both lies, and both lies were now entering the official record of a criminal case where they could be checked. Because Ray had legally exported those security logs months earlier as the guard whose job it was to monitor them, and the originals proved the cameras had never failed at all. They had been switched off on a schedule by someone with the authority to do it. Every forged piece of evidence they filed against him would now sit beside a true version they didn't know existed. And what none of them had accounted for was that the complete record, the logs, the doctored entries, the shortfall that matched the robbery, the flow of money that led up to Diane Kessler, was no longer sitting only in Ray's hands. A copy of all of it was already with a federal investigator in the anti-money laundering unit, a contact Ray had reached out to quietly from the very beginning, along with Alice's sworn account, prepared in advance for exactly this night. Ray sat in a holding cell and thought about Marcus Doyle, who had no one preparing anything for him, and about Maddie, who would be told her father had been arrested and would not understand why. Then he leaned back against the wall and waited because the last part was already moving, and it no longer needed him to move it. Ray was released within a day, and the people who had arrested him barely registered that it happened. There was no reason they would. A night guard with a record held on suspicion of a robbery quietly let go when the charges failed to hold. It was beneath the notice of a branch manager who believed he had already won and was busy closing the books on the whole affair before anyone looked too hard. Preston had moved on to the only thing that mattered to him now, which was finishing the paperwork that turned a real robbery into a solved case with a convenient suspect and a balanced ledger. The federal investigator holding Ray's evidence had made a quiet call, and Ray walked out with everything still in place, the machine still unaware it had already lost. He went home first before anything else. He sat with Maddie on the floor of the neighbor's apartment and let her show him 3 new drawings, and he told her he was fine, that the confusion at work had been sorted out, that she didn't need to carry any of it. She was 8, and she believed him because he had spent her whole life making sure she could. Then he kissed the top of her head and went to do the last part of the thing he had come back 2 years to do. The reckoning came at the branch itself on the morning the case was meant to be formally closed. Preston had assembled it like a performance because performance was what he understood. Police were there to sign off on the robbery investigation. A federal investigator was there, though Preston believed that presence to be routine. Employees stood at the edges, and Preston, confident and expansive, walked the room through the story he had built. The desperate guard, the record that spoke for itself, the crime that wrote its own ending. He gestured at Ray, brought in for the occasion, shown, and delivered the same certainty he'd delivered the night of the arrest. He was still talking when the federal investigator stepped forward, and it became clear very quickly that the man had not come to close the case Preston thought he was closing. The investigator set down a comparison, the branch's original security logs beside the report that had declared those logs destroyed, and beside them the doctored transaction entries laid against the true figures. Ray stood while it happened, and when the room turned to him, he told them who he was. Not the night guard. The internal fraud investigator that Meridian had employed and framed and forced out 2 years earlier over the exact operations still running through this building. Whatever certainty had been holding Preston upright drained out of him, and his face found no expression to replace it. He started to reach for the tools that had always worked before. A disgruntled former employee, a convicted man with a grudge, a story invented by someone with every reason to lie. It was the same defense the company had used to bury Ray 2 years earlier, and Ray had built this entire thing knowing Preston would reach for it, which was precisely why he had never let any of it rest on his own word. Ray let him finish, and then he answered without raising his voice. He told the room they did not need to take his word for any of it. The proof did not live in his testimony. It lived in the bank's own records, and all he had done was learn to read what was already there. He walked them through it plainly, because plainness was the weapon here. The camera logs that proved the failures had never been failures at all, but scheduled shutdowns triggered by someone with the authority to trigger them. The transaction entries that were wrong at night and corrected by morning in a rhythm no honest bookkeeping produces. And the number that undid everything, the amount reported stolen in the robbery, sitting to the dollar atop a shortfall the operation had created months before any robber ever touched the vault. The theft had been real. The use Preston made of it had been a lie, and the lie was written in the bank's own ledgers for anyone who knew where to look. The room understood it the way a room does when a thing that cannot be unseen is placed in front of it. Gordon Pike understood first, which fit everything Ray knew about him, and he was already looking for the door that wasn't there, because a man who controls the cameras and the vault codes cannot claim he didn't know when both were used against his own branch. Preston understood next, and the confidence went out of him all at once the way air goes out of a thing that was only ever held up by pressure. The federal investigator laid out what came next, plainly, and for the record, so that every person in the room heard the same words at the same time. The branch's assets were frozen. The robbery investigation was folded into something far larger, a federal money laundering case that reached across every branch the route had ever touched. Preston Vale and Gordon Pike were taken into custody where they stood. And Diane Kessler, the regional deputy who had coordinated the money between offices and who had signed the file that ended Ray's career, was suspended and named her role as the connective tissue of the entire operation finally written down by someone she couldn't fire. The evidence came apart in the order Ray had assembled it, and each piece closed on the person it belonged to. Preston Vale. Gordon Pike and Diane Kessler were the three who had run the machine and turned a real robbery into a tool to hide it. The camera logs proved Gordon had shut the system down on schedule. The doctored ledgers and the matching shortfall proved Preston had run the nighttime transactions and used the theft to balance them. The record of money moving between branches reconciled across all of them proved Diane had been the one coordinating it from above. All three were charged money laundering obstruction, the framing of an innocent man, and all three had their assets frozen, and there would be no quiet settlement and no 2-year burial this time, because the case had been built precisely so that none of that was possible. Marcus Doyle was handled apart from the others because his part was its own kind of thing. He had entered the false figures and stayed silent out of fear, and that silence had helped the machine run. But he had also been the one person in the branch who had quietly kept copies of the original ledgers, instead of destroying them, a small hedge he had never found the courage to use. He cooperated fully, in exchange for a reduced finding, kept his freedom, lost his job, and would not be prosecuted, as the men above him would. It was not forgiveness. It was the difference between the people who built the trap and the young man who had been caught in it and was too frightened to speak until someone else went first. The pieces that Ray cared about most were not the arrests. They were the people the machine had ground down on its way through the world. Alice Reyes was reinstated and cleared the concerns about her audit, exposed as the retaliation they were, and she became a central protected witness in the case that followed the auditor, who had refused to let the numbers lie. The customers whose accounts had been quietly used to move money without their knowledge were identified and made whole. And the employees who had been removed from the company before Ray, the earlier casualties of the same route, the ones who had been pushed out and never understood, why were pulled back into the light. Their records reviewed their names, cleared the harm done to them, finally acknowledged by people with the authority to acknowledge it. And the fabricated file from 2 years earlier, the embezzlement that had never happened, the suspended sentence Ray had swallowed to protect his daughter, was reopened and struck down. The record came off. For the first time in 2 years, Ray Coleman's name meant only what it was supposed to mean, and nothing that had been painted onto it by people who needed him discredited. Meridian was placed under regulatory supervision and forced to rebuild its internal controls from the ground up. The reforms were specific, and some of them Ray had asked for by name. Independent oversight of the security system so that no single person could darken a camera on a schedule and call it a glitch. Real protection for employees who reported what they saw so that the next Marcus Doyle would have somewhere to turn that wasn't a locked room. A review of every account and every dismissal the route had touched, because the operation had run for years, and there was no reason to believe Ray had found the last of its victims. He asked for nothing for himself. No settlement, no title, no return to the career they had taken from him, no acknowledgement beyond the clearing of his name. The only thing he required, and he required it plainly, was that the reviews be thorough, that every employee the operation had wronged be found and cleared. Not just the ones whose names had already surfaced, because for every casualty they could see there was likely another, that no one had thought to look for someone who had accepted a ruined name because no one had ever come back for them. Ray had come back for them. That was the whole of what he had wanted underneath everything else. He drove home the evening it ended, and for a while he just sat in the car outside the neighbor's building, letting it be over. Maddie was waiting for him, and when he came in, she asked him the question she had been circling for weeks in the direct way that only children manage. She wanted to know why all this time he had only ever been a guard, when he used to do something at a bank that had a longer name she couldn't remember. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She was 8 and sharp, and she had noticed the way she noticed everything that her father had been carrying, something she couldn't see. He told her the truth at the size she could hold. He said that sometimes the most important thing a person can do looks like nothing at all from the outside, that a man can spend a long time seeming small and unimportant while he quietly sets something right. And he told her the part that mattered most to him, the part he had held on to through every cold night on that branch floor. That there are wrongs a person has to fix, and not because those wrongs hurt him, but because if he doesn't fix them, no one else will, and the people they're hurting will go on being hurt in the dark. She didn't fully understand it. She would someday. For now, she just leaned against him, and he let the weight of 2 years finally set itself down. Preston Vale ended with nothing undone by the bank's own records, the camera he darkened on a schedule, the numbers he was far too arrogant to imagine anyone beneath him could read. That is the thing a certain kind of power never learns in time. Authority that has to silence the people it wrongs was never strength to begin with. It was fear in a manager's suit, and the moment one overlooked man refused to disappear, all of it came apart. Here is what's worth taking with you long after the arrests are over. The truest measure of a person is never how they treat the ones who can lift them higher, it's how they treat the ones they've quietly decided don't count. The best among us do the opposite of what Preston did. They learn the name of the guard, the teller, the person the room walks past, and they treat that person as if they matter because they do. Live that way. Be the one who looks twice, who listens to the quiet person in the corner, who refuses to mistake a job title for the size of a soul. Because the day you reduce a human being to a label is the day you stop seeing the one person who sees all the way through you. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with the channel. There are more coming about quiet people, buried truths and justice that arrives from exactly where no one thought to look.